Welcome to Coda Zero Earth. My name is Kate Charlesworth. I'm in Sydney in Australia, and together with my colleague Forbes McGain in Melbourne, we will be co-hosting today's episode. Firstly, we would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet and to pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. Wherever you are in the world today, we ask that you also take a moment to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which you stand. Today we are proud to collaborate with Teleflex, who are supporting this educational event. Teleflex are passionate advocates for advancing the cause of sustainable healthcare and corporate social responsibility in the medical device industry. Our first conversation is about the climate health emergency. Tim Flannery, there is now overwhelming evidence that we are at the start of a climate breakdown and a sixth mass extinction. How bad is it?
Well, look, Kate, the truth is that we're now entering a phase of rapid acceleration of threat. And that threat ranges from sea level rise to extreme weather events to the downstream health impacts and things like bushfires. And just one example that's still very raw for me is the Australian bushfires of this last summer. Yeah, we had 2 years in a row, driest records over southeastern Australia ever, and then the hottest year in Australia ever. And the bushfire kind of volume went from about 2%, the worst case previously was about 2% of the forest burning, to 21% of the forest burning. And the downstream impacts of that were massive. We had huge problems with smoke inhalation, we had a number of people killed in the fires, and of course, huge biodiversity impacts. Now that's happening at an average global temperature of about just over 1 degree Celsius. That's the increase that we've experienced. Here in Australia, we're already at 1.5 degrees above the pre-industrial average, just because it's a flat continent in the tropics. The situation is going to really start getting worse, unfortunately, because we are committed to an outcome a bit like the pandemic. You know how the figures we see with COVID today result from events that occurred at some time in the past, maybe the last 2 weeks, you know. Climate change is the same. The CO2 that is causing the warming doesn't reach its full warming potential for several decades, so it pre-commits us to a worse outcome. And my big fear is that we won't act before we start hitting the tipping points where the climate system really takes over and you get positive feedback loops that then make action ineffective. So this is the moment of crisis, really. This is the moment to act.
How long have we got then?
Oh, look, I think it's a matter of years. We're approaching the point where we're absolutely committed to 1.5 degrees of warming. Within the next decade, we'll be committed to 2 degrees of warming, and if we hit that, then it's fairly certain we'll start crossing these thresholds. So we have to actually, this is the moment to act and start cutting that risk as fast as we can by cutting fossil fuel use.
Okay, thank you. Courtney Howard, you're an emergency doctor. Is this an emergency, and what are the issues for health?
Absolutely. When you think about how we manage clinical illness in the emerge, we have time windows for action, and we know that time is heart, time is, in this case, time is planet. So we have 2 sprints. We have an adaptation sprint that we need to undertake to manage the warming we're already committed to, as Tim has said. So that means we need to make sure that our operating rooms have great ventilation systems to cope with wildfire smoke, et cetera. And then we need to prevent what we can't cope with. And so when we think about what Tim has said and their health corollaries, wildfires equal trauma, evacuation, PTSD, huge clouds of smoke that have been shown increasingly to increase overall mortality, heat emergencies, heat stress, heat stroke, longer and more severe pollen seasons make for worsened hay fever. We're seeing severe weather events, which cause trauma, evacuation, contaminate water supplies. All of this means that our crops are more unreliable, and we're seeing decreasing food yields worldwide, which leads to increased malnutrition. And all of this, you can imagine, if your kid doesn't have food, and as a parent, you do almost anything to get your kid food, you may need to move to another place. So that's the migration that Tim is speaking of. So as a humanitarian working with Doctors Without Borders, all of the psychosocial and sequelae of refugee work, and then conflict, which we know is horrible for health. And what's really important for us to recognize as healthcare professionals is our healthcare systems depend on functioning borders and a functioning global society. And so not only does this put health at risk, it puts functioning healthcare systems at risk as well.
Yeah, thanks, Coda. I mean, Tim, if I could come back to you, I think there's a huge frustration in the health profession because if doctors fail to act on this level of evidence in our medical practice, we would be negligent and we'd be in danger of losing our medical registration.
Yeah.
And yet leaders and governments seem to get away with dismissing and failing to act on overwhelming scientific evidence. How has this been, how and why has there been this sort of campaign of misinformation, and where does that leave us now?
Well, look, the sad truth, Kate, is that we've known for many decades now what the outcome would be if we don't cut fossil fuels. And the key work done in this area was initially done by ExxonMobil, a big oil company in the early 1980s that did the climate projections. They paid for climate scientists to do the work. They projected where we'd be by 2020, and lo and behold, we're here. And that projection was based on the premise that there would be no effective action to limit fossil fuel use, which was their objective. That was their business, is to produce fossil fuels and to see it burned. I guess some of the people who did that believed it was a long way off, or maybe they believed they could go into some gated community and isolate themselves and their children from the impacts. But that's just not the nature of the world we live in. We are all interconnected, and these consequences are now very severe. You also see, as part of a long-term penetration of our government, that there are government ministers here and elsewhere who will serve in the resources portfolio or energy portfolio and then retire and go onto the board of a fossil fuel company. So the links have been there all along. We have people in the Australian Parliament who own coal mines. You know, we have lobbyists who write the rule, or people who write the rules, for government on fossil fuels and so forth, who started as lobbyists in the fossil fuel industry and then go back to the fossil fuel industry when they've done their stint in government. It's the system is just intermeshed in a way where power, wealth and influence are all skewed against us, and trying to understand how urgent this threat is and to take action, because it threatens the immediate wealth of a few.
Mm-hmm. So, Courtney, for us, for health professionals, this is a pretty familiar story because, of course, it's well documented now that the tactics used by the fossil fuel industry, discrediting scientists, obfuscation, intense political lobbying, are precisely the same tactics that were used for decades by the tobacco industry. And as Tim has said, they are powerful, they are well-funded and well connected, and they have been very successful in delaying an appropriate response to the climate crisis. And yet, on our side, we have that health professionals are the most trusted and the most respected professional group in society. How can we use that influence to lead action?
Yeah, great question. So something that's really worthwhile knowing is that according to research done by Ed Maybach and others, presenting climate change as a health threat is actually the best way to motivate action across the political spectrum. However, because this hasn't been in curricula, we haven't been teaching politicians what they actually need to know. So they actually don't know the bottom lines. I briefed the federal health minister here in Canada and watched the penny drop. We watched her go, oh, this isn't about a slightly warmer world. This is about wildfires, evacuation, and potential systemic collapse. That is our job. Here in Canada, there was a survey of lobbying at the federal level that showed that basically the ministers and staff were getting lobbied 5 times as much by the fossil fuel industry as by non-governmental actors. We can change that. Basically are the best messengers for the most effective message to help people understand, which will help both from adaptation and mitigation. And what's great is that most of the measures, or a lot of the measures that decrease fossil fuel use, also decrease air pollution. We know that the WHO says that we're losing about 7 million people worldwide every year to air pollution. So if we move to electric vehicles that are made with clean energy, in Canada, for instance, we lose 1,000 people every year, as far as we can tell, from air pollution related to transport. So there's real-time health co-benefits to a lot of this work that not only improve health, but save healthcare dollars right now. So the more we can communicate both the health problems and the health benefits of climate action, or the health problems associated with inaction and the benefits of action, the more effective our messaging will be.
Yeah, no, certainly the co-benefits argument also is, is a very effective one here. I just wanted to turn to gas because it's such a big issue here in Australia, and I know also in Canada, Courtney, and I will come on to you. But what we're seeing here at the moment, to continue with this theme, is the gas industry now trying to position itself as a transition fuel or as a clean fuel, when there's emerging evidence to show that when you take into account fugitive methane emissions, it's just as polluting as coal. Tim, if I could ask you, what is the true situation about gas and what can we do?
Sure. Well, look, in Australia, the gas industry's gone from almost nowhere a decade or two ago to today, where we're one of the largest exporters on the planet, along with coal, and there's an $80 billion investment being made in that gas infrastructure, and people want to see that pay off. So we're seeing now a huge lobbying effort, I think, to encourage government to spend my tax dollars and every other Australian tax dollars on projects to benefit gas. But the truth of the matter is we don't need gas as a transition fuel now. We might need to continue using a small amount, but in states like South Australia, which are most advanced in terms of the energy transition, they don't have any more coal, they've got lots of renewables. There, the amount of gas being burnt over the last decade's actually gone down a little bit and is projected to go down further. So it's not like there's a gas boom on. We'll need a little bit of gas to make the transition, but it's a short-term limited thing. And to see governments talking about spending billions of dollars for transcontinental pipelines and so forth, you realise how desperate the situation is, and we just must actually cut all fossil fuels. Gas is a very polluting fossil fuel. We simply cannot afford to have it in the mix long term. Otherwise, we will forfeit our future.
Courtney, what's the gas situation in Canada, and how are health professionals responding?
It's very similar to what Tim just described in Australia. And what's important to note is that our governments are in many cases subsidizing this work. So for instance, the biggest liquefied natural gas plant in British Columbia is requiring huge subsidies from both the government of British Columbia and the government of Canada. That's our money. And so what's really important, we need to reframe this. So they've basically gotten away with calling it natural gas, which sounds amazing. I picture like a swoopy Ken doll natural gas. In fact, it's a super pollutant. And so we need to reframe methane as a super pollutant. I've thought about getting my kids to dress up as Darth Vapor for Halloween. We need that level of visual messaging across the world to reframe gas as the super pollutant that it is. Important to know, it often comes from fracking. And we haven't done the studies we need to do to determine the local health impacts of fracking. It's one of those situations where there's not enough studies, there's red flags in the ones that have been done. And when we go looking, we're gonna find big problems. So get rid of gas, stop the fracking, let's move straight to renewables.
Okay, thanks, Courtney. Forbes, I'll hand over to you now. I see some audience questions. I see we've sort of dealt with some of the questions relating to gas, but Forbes, some other questions for the panelists?
Yeah, so there's a few trickling through. Thank you, team. And thanks to everyone who's sending questions. Please pop them in now. I think there's an important question there, particularly about the gas towards the end. It's and I might, Omnia, perhaps if you're able to respond, maybe you could tell us in Egypt, for example, I don't actually know what the source of energy for Egypt mainly is. Is it perhaps oil-based or is it gas? And how does this seem to you, to perhaps nations like Egypt, which are obviously needing energy, and this whole discussion you've just heard about gas, for example, how does that fit in?
Yes, that is very interesting because I come from a slightly different perspective. In Egypt, we are a combination of both oil and natural gas based. But again, we really we find it very difficult to invest in renewable energy because of how expensive it is, and our economy is really restarting since the turmoils that we've had before. However, we have new initiatives being set in Egypt and a huge vision for the next 10 years. And they're really prioritizing investing in solar energy. And Egypt really wants to champion itself as one of the countries in the Middle East region that had done that transition. So this is kind of I think an inspiring way to motivate countries to try to champion themselves by transitioning into renewable energy. And especially in Egypt, we have the best resource and very sustainable source, especially for solar energy. And we're even applying that in our own healthcare facilities as well as the airport railways.
Thank you very much, Omnia. Michelle, perhaps a comment of what's happening in the US there at the moment. I understand there might be an election there soon, but certainly it's sort of exciting times, I think.
It certainly is, and definitely there is an unprecedented early turnout to vote. And a lot of the focus of voters, certainly here in the US, is on the environment, particularly with the the wildfires we're seeing on the West Coast throughout California, it is top of mind here.
Thank you. Kate, we could probably move to the next section.
Sure. Just to finish up on the, thanks Forbes, just to finish up on this one, a question for you, Tim. How much do we actually contribute to the climate crisis here in Australia, and where are we tracking as a nation? Because I think there's a fair bit of misconceptions about that.
Yeah, look, per capita, we're one of the largest polluters on the planet. Overall, we produce about 1.4% of the total pollution, and that's used as an excuse for inaction. But during the Second World War, Australian troops made up about 1.4% of the Allied forces. And if the Prime Minister had said, well, we're only 1.4% of the Allied forces, it doesn't make any difference if we try a bit harder, he'd be accused of treason. And it's the same thing. Yes, we're 1.4%, but we're a very important 1.4%, and we need to do our best to reduce our impact so others will follow our lead.
Yeah, I certainly noticed, like watching something like Fight for Planet A on the ABC, the huge amount of surprise from so many people that we're actually one of the highest per capita emitters in the world, because that's certainly
Indeed.
not what is portrayed by the government.